The agenda this week examined the economic weight of small business. We remembered bravery on a Belgian battlefield and turned our attention to Turkey's global role as well. The agenda's week in review begins with crumbling infrastructure. Would better monitoring earlier in the process help?
One of the really surprising things about these projects is how many of them start before you have a finalized plan.
You start building before you have a finalized plan.
You start signing contracts and you start building before you have a finalized plan.
Does that make sense?
No. The short answer is no. I mean, we do it for all sorts of reasons. We might want to start because that's when we have the budget. The budget comes in that year. We know that once we start the construction, it's going to be very hard to cancel our project. But we often start these projects without having a full sense of what we're actually going to be building. So that's a very simple, obvious thing. Don't start until you have a full complement of understanding of what you're going to be building, until you have a full plan, until you have political sign-off. How often do politicians come in after the plan has been set and say, oh, I want another station? That's a huge cost. And once you have a contract with someone, to change that contract is very costly.
That was the story on the Sky Dome. You know, we want a baseball stadium with a roof. Oh, wait, we want a hotel. Oh, wait, we want a fitness center. Oh, wait, we want, and pretty soon it's 5 times as expensive.
And so that's one thing to keep in mind when you're looking at all of those numbers, is to keep in mind that sometimes the scope changes dramatically. So the contract managers will say, it wasn't actually our fault. We were on budget in terms of what we said we were going to do, but the scope changed dramatically. Not on all of these projects. Many of these projects just had straight contract management problems. But we do see in some of these cases, for all sorts of reasons, the scope starts to creep. We call it scope creep. And it creeps and it creeps, and sometimes it even gallops. And you see these massive changes in the project. If you look from the beginning to the middle to the end, you're actually building something very different, and that's when the costs can escalate too. I mean, anyone who's done a home renovation has this experience. Once the wall's open, maybe we should put in a new bathroom, or maybe we should put in a fireplace. Once we've started this, let's get our dream home. But the challenge is when you have a contract with someone, that can be very problematic in terms of how you then lock in that cost. You've lost a lot of leverage as a project manager once that's signed, especially if you don't know exactly what you're building before you start.
Okay, so more solutions here. I understand. Don't start building until you've actually signed off on a final design. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. What else?
So I think there's 2 real places where we can focus. One is on the technical side. Definitely don't start building until you know what you're doing. Also, we need to be using information and past experience a lot more systematically. Data analytics, if you will, to understand how these projects are working, where the specific risks and the specific problems are coming up in our different types of projects. So it's interesting, when you think about sports has essentially become an analytics business. They collect a ton of data. They now have these science departments, these analytics departments who are measuring what's going on the projects. We need to be doing that with infrastructure. We need to make this much more systematic. And then the second part of this is using that knowledge to then create incentives that incentivize the contractors and the government to deliver on what they say they're going to do. So public-private partnerships are one model that tries to incentivize to use private finance, in this case, especially during construction, so that the contractor has what's known as skin in the game. They have their own incentive. It's performance-based. They're not going to get paid the full amount from government until this project is done, until it's done properly, reaches substantial completion, and gets signed off on. So they have a lot more incentive to finish rather than to start making claims, because they're out to their lenders. Their lenders are going to want their money back with interest, and the longer that goes, the higher the interest payments are. So that's one model. And then we need to use information to track how people are performing and use that to assign future projects. It seems surprising that when you apply for your next contract after you made a mistake on your past one, or your past number of projects, there's not necessarily a mechanism to say, we systematically understand that you haven't performed very well. We're going to hold that against you to some extent when you build your next project. We need to be much more systematic, but you can only do that if you have data that allows you to understand how different firms are performing, how different projects are performing, and then use that information to make better decisions in the future.
Let's play a little soundbite here, because one of the reasons we're talking about this tonight is because the heavens fell in when the Mayor of Toronto announced that the Spadina extension, which was the westernmost of the 2 sort of north-south subway lines, loop in Toronto, is way over budget and way behind schedule. Mr. Director, roll it please.
Today, we're talking about the York-Spadina subway, but the fact is, over the years, we have lurched from one fiasco to another, costing taxpayers millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, and just as important, delaying the day we get desperately needed transit into service to move people. Suffice it to say, alongside the people of Toronto, I am furious that this happens over and over again on the city's watch.
Okay, I have to go first to the former chair
Yes.
of the TTC here, who may have had a little bit of this
Yeah,
happen
you know,
on her
and-
watch. What happened here?
Well, again, it's been a while since I've been the chair of the TTC, but while I was there, we knew this project was going to be over budget because we knew we had a contractor that wasn't delivering. And he was building a critical station right in the middle of the line. And so it was, and it's a challenge because we tried to negotiate with the contractor. They stopped work. They wanted us to pay them more, but they actually bid through a process and were awarded the project because they bid the low bid, and then they told us they couldn't do the work for what they bid. So it's a very
And this, just to be clear, was not a P3.
this was not a P3. No,
This is the TTC contracting out directly.
Yes, to the private sector to build the station. And I mean, the tunnels were built on time, the other stations were built on time. We had one station that was not. And there's no question that we didn't manage public expectations very well on it, and they feel, and rightly feel, as if billions of dollars have been wasted. And again, having a public-private partnership do this project wouldn't have helped.
You know, Mark, would it have helped if it were a P3 instead of the TTC directly managing it?
I think so, because a public-private partnership is an agreement between governments and the private sector. It's a fixed-price contract with well-articulated outcomes and expectations over the course of the project. And the private sector, as a team, the consortium that's bidding this project, is in fact making sure they integrate the design with the construction, with the financing from external sources, along with the maintenance. So if you have a bad design, the construction guy can't say, I can't build that, the design doesn't work for me, because they are a team. And so if in fact there is a cost overrun because of design changes or construction schedules, the nature of this arrangement requires that it's the private sector companies as a team that actually absorb the cost, any cost overrun.
Karen Stintz?
Well, if you have a bad contractor, you have a bad contractor, and the private sector is only going to absorb the cost until they don't make a profit. But the private sector does not do this as a volunteer opportunity or for free, and so they're only going to do it if they get paid to do it. And as soon as they stop getting their money and their return, because everyone has shareholders, so as soon as the private sector stops getting their return, they will go back to their government funder and say, we need more money.
Ian, is there any reason to believe that this project would not be so egregiously over budget and behind schedule if it had been a P3, a private-public partnership from the beginning, as opposed to the way it went?
You know, it depends on the actual agreement that is struck. We don't know what that would have been like. Mark's right. When you combine design, build, operate, finance, there's some efficiencies that you can have when you're doing all those things together. Potentially that could happen. You can put the risk of cost overruns and time delays on the private sector if you structure the contract in a way that does that. But you're going to pay for that. I mean, if the private sector is going to bear those risks, they want some return for that.
But at least it might get done on time and on budget.
Well, it might. Again, it depends on the way the agreement is struck and how the risks are shared and who's paying for those risks.
So Karen's absolutely right. The Auditor General report identified what I've seen in a number of the P3 business cases, and that is that there is absolutely no evidence for the risk transfer. Absolutely no evidence. All of the P3s in Ontario are assumed on the basis that massive amounts of risk was transferred to the private sector, but there's not a shred of evidence for that.
Do small businesses really transform neighborhoods in a way that an 80-story condo and whatever comes around it can as well?
Well, I think for sure, but I also think it's important to recognize that Toronto has multiple neighborhoods, and some research shows we have like various cities in one city. And so who lives and works in one neighborhood is very different in other pockets and outer suburbs of the neighborhood. So one of the things that I think the work that we're focusing on is how do we make reduce the barriers for micro-entrepreneurship and small scale so that more low-income individuals can enter the micro-entrepreneurship world and enter in small scale business. We also see that while we're describing neighborhoods and main streets, that a lot of these tower communities in the outer suburbs don't have active BIAs and they don't have an active main street. They live in pockets. And so the question is, what can we do to revitalize those tower communities that have small towns living in, 3 to 4
What do you call them? Tower
communities?
What does that mean?
So, if you think about downtown, you have St. Jamestown, which is a huge set of towers, but out in Thorncliffe Park, in that neighborhood, you have over 35 towers. 30,000 people live mostly all in huge apartment towers.
That's in Premier Wynn's riding.
That's in Premier Wynn's riding. And one of the things the city is working on is we've changed the zoning to work on resident apartment commercial zoning, so we can have support small scale commercial and community use on the main floor of some of these private apartment buildings, because I think that's part of the challenge on, if you don't have main streets, where's the role for small business? Where is the opportunity for people who want to set up shop, and there's a lot of financial barriers perhaps on a main street, or cultural and social barriers to go outside of your neighborhood. So we have to think new ways.
In which case, Cindy, do you ever worry that BIAs are leading the way in some neighborhoods at the expense of other neighborhoods that don't have them?
I don't think so necessarily. I think exactly as Adriana has pointed to, that we have a whole series of ways now that we're trying to get at these shared objectives. So these informal community kind of organizations, it's not just business, but it's also the public realm. Raphael's book talked about a lot of things I thought was really important in terms of just the beauty of our cities. And that is one thing that BIAs contribute to, but there are other ways that you can try to make sure that you're actually doing things that improve quality of life, and that's actually fundamental. So I don't think it's all about BIAs. It's always about a shared set of interests that a whole variety of players, large and small, can bring forward. A big role of it is the public sector at all levels of government, but also private enterprise, micro, mini, and macro.
Okay, but where the BIAs come into play in this thing is that we bring our money to the table.
Right.
We're not, the days of waiting for the local government to do things for us went the way of the dodo bird back in the 70s, and the BIAs are that model. This year alone, BIAs are levying themselves, Toronto BIAs, the 81 BIAs, $34 million. $34 million above and beyond the taxes that we're paying to invest in city infrastructure, into city, well-being, and we learned very quickly. And the message we try to get out is how Main Street goes, so goes the rest of the neighborhood.
That's right.
Safe, vibrant Main Street absolutely increases the assessed value of properties that are immediately around
But
there.
Raphael, it does raise a question. If you're one of those neighborhoods where you've got a good, strong small business community that's prepared to pay the levies and make the beautification that you've talked about, John, great. But if you don't, if you're in a low income, what they call, I guess, priority neighborhoods right now, and you don't have these assets, are you screwed?
Well, no, but you can learn from the BIA movement and the Metcalfe Foundation's work in this area on building local resilience. So you think of the small business, you almost think, oh, that's the bottom of the totem pole and you want to aspire to a big chain and then become a big box realtor. But no, it's the other way around. You have micro entrepreneurs that have businesses in their basements or in their kitchens that aspire to the small shop on the main street. And you can, if you have spaces like we just mentioned, either in sort of parking lots or school fronts that aren't used on weekends, where you can set up markets for these micro entrepreneurs that are building up to maybe owning a shop on a main street, you need the ecology view of the city and the business environment. So you can take cues from the BIA movement, in which coming together, pooling resources, gives you more voice, and you do that at a more smaller level, micro level. And of course, then the next step is, how do you make a business that's been successful in one neighborhood perhaps migrate to another? How do you give them the skills, the capital that would allow them to become a small chain in a big city? And research has shown local independent chain, so a chain but that's based locally, is by far the biggest employer of local citizens and local workers.
What was the overarching philosophy or approach or attitude towards business/capitalism that you wanted your graduates to leave the school with?
That it's a positive sum game, right? I hate kind of zero-sum business people, which is, I'll make a buck if I get it out of your hide. I love business people who say, let's see, if we can have a great company that produces great products that make our customers better, we can hire great employees, we can have, they'll all pay taxes, we'll pay taxes, that'll invest in the infrastructure that'll make whatever our city or our province better off. Just have a positive sum game where everybody wins. And I think it's one of the beautiful things about business at its best. Everybody wins. The community wins, employees win, the shareholders win, customers win, and that's what I want people to go off saying.
Except that the people who believe in a more, can I put it, rapacious view of capitalism thought you were a bit of a wet. Can I put it that way?
Sure. I mean, some of the things I've written, there are people who don't like very much, my 2011 book, which we've talked about before on your show, that sort of indicted a lot of what goes on Wall Street. They don't like much, but I guess that never bothered me. I think really good business people, really good students, they want to do the right thing, and there are plenty of them. And what I'd like to do is have them overwhelm the rapacious ones, and have the rapacious ones feel isolated, not part of the mainstream. And that's where I think where business gets into trouble, when the rapacious zero-sum gamers become the mainstream, and then everybody sort of says, well, I guess that's the way business is done.
I wonder who has the upper hand now, the corporate social responsibility people or the rapacious capitalism people?
I do think that the folks who make an argument that says we need a better form of business and the rapaciousness is really, really costly, 2008, 9, and the fallout certainly helped their cause. I would say before that, I think the rapacious folks were saying, hey, we'll keep dancing till the music stops, and not, the famous Chuck Prince, CEO of Citibank, said in the summer of 2008, we'll keep dancing till the music stops. Well, when the music stops, a lot of people got really, really, really
damn near
badly
took the whole
hurt.
financial system down with you.
Yeah. And so I think the people who say, we just can't have that attitude. We've got to keep, in some sense, the music going in a sensible way, not in a crazy, bubbly way, so that the average working family in whatever, in America or Canada, can say, if we work hard, if we save and invest, we'll have a better life. Our children will have a better life. I mean, it's important that people have a confidence in that.
A few years ago, Turkey was everybody's favorite country in the way it managed to kind of blend these two competing interests. One doesn't hear that kind of praise much anymore. What's happened?
Well, look, a number of things happened. One is, I think the government in Turkey, especially President Erdogan now, has become or is perceived as being too power hungry, too insistent on changing the political system in Turkey to create a presidential system that will make him the most important and the central character. And there's kind of a reaction to that. Secondly, the Arab Spring emerged, and in the Arab Spring, Turkey initially played its cards well, then changed its mind, and then again started to play its cards well. But the Arab Spring turned out to be, not because of Turkey's fault, turned out to be a disaster for the region and disaster for Turkey as well. Turkey lost markets, Turkey lost influence. The new governments in the region have turned out to be very, very unstable. You saw President Morsi take over in Egypt, then get overthrown by the military. That is at odds with Turkey. So some of it is Turkey's fault. Some of it is the Turks did not manage to manage their relationship with, but also because the Turkish government has become increasingly authoritarian, increasingly unwilling to listen to dissenting viewpoints. And this insistence on changing the political system has made people a little bit wary of Turkey.
Let me follow up with Professor Turam on that. You know, of course, that the president wants to, constitutionally speaking, acquire more power for himself going forward. Do we have any idea what he wants to do with that added power?
Well, he's trying to increase his powers just not within the nation, but regionally and internationally. And for a long time, actually, since he came to power for the second time, since 2007, he's been working on increasing his powers by changing institutions, changing law, passing bills overnight. And he has, as Professor Barkey explained, he has turned out to be a very authoritarian leader. There are a lot of violations of human rights, political and civil and individual rights in Turkey. And if he can actually convince his voters to vote for a presidential system, he aspires to change the system entirely. And that is going to give him a lot of power to control different parts of the state, not just society, not just people, but also the state.
Professor Baban, we're going to bring a picture up, speaking of pictures, and this is the new presidential palace in Ankara. If you look at the monitor over your shoulder there, you'll see it. 1,000 rooms. What does this say to you about President Erdogan?
Well, yes, that palace actually is quite interesting because it is an ostentatious building, and I actually had the chance to see the actual place, in physical place, when I was in Ankara. And it looks much more grotesque than it actually looks on picture. And now it's an interesting thing because Erdogan always portrayed himself as one of the downtrodden and marginalized and poor, and he was the champion of that. But now, building a palace like that is rather interesting, and living in a palace like that, because we don't know the exact cost of the palace, but the one estimate is around $1 billion. The Association of Ankara Architects, they actually raise it all the way up to $2 billion. But I think there is a symbolism to that palace.
Which is what?
And the symbolism is that the Erdogan, since 2011 election, is giving a very clear message that, and using the terminology of New Turkey, and the New Turkey is that, with symbols that is influenced by the Turkish history, the Turkish traditions, as the Turkish Republic, secular republic, cut its ties with its history too sharply, Erdogan claims to restore those traditions. So this palace is a mishmash of architectural styles. There's a bit of an Ottoman style there. There's a bit of a Selçuklu, the older Turkish empire. Inside, the decoration is like that. So there is an attempt to actually project a new identity, new image.
Well, let me follow up with Professor Barkey on that. A new style and a new image. On the other hand, does it seem a bit like he's trying to project himself as the new Ataturk?
I think he has greater ambitions than that in terms of he wants to be. Look, it's very difficult to replace Ataturk in Turkish history. I mean, nobody can replace him, but there's a way of surpassing him, if you want, in the sense that Erdogan can claim that he's won more elections, really democratic elections, and that's true, than Ataturk has, and he has achieved all these things by getting the people's consent rather than doing it by diktat like Ataturk did. But of course, it's a different time period, etc. I think you can call it a second Ataturk, but I don't necessarily think that Erdogan sees himself as, or compares himself to Ataturk. I think he sees himself in a much grander, much larger historical figure, and somebody who's going to be in Turkish history for longer in some ways than Ataturk has. But still, in many people's minds, nobody can replace Ataturk. So it's a different approach, I think.
Professor Turam, there's still, I think, a great chunk of Turkey that loves Ataturk. And I wonder whether you feel President Erdogan is similarly loved by a large chunk of the population.
Well, the comparison is very difficult, but let me say this. Different time periods. So Ataturk promised independence to his people, and he told them that he was building a modern nation state, building a nation, and he actually delivered that. So whatever he promised, he gave. Yes, he may have been authoritarian, but at that time, we're talking about 1920s and 30s, Turkey is coming out of an empire. He had to disconnect with an empire. So when Erdogan mobilized people to vote for him, he did a good campaign, and he actually promised a better democracy, because Turkey was already an institutional democracy with some problems and weaknesses. But he promised a better, deeper democracy with more rights, because freedom of religion was a problem. And so most of the liberal Democrats, even social democrats, believed him that he wanted more freedoms. But at the end of the day, he delivered none of what he promised. Turkey is not a better democracy. It's actually a much more authoritarian state. And the only freedom that he agrees to deliver has been freedom of religion. Although Ataturk was very authoritarian, it was a dictatorship in a sense. He didn't like this agreement, but his inheritance was different. He made sure that Turkey, he was forward-looking. He made sure that Turkey was going to turn out to be a democracy. Whereas in Erdogan's case, we don't see this forward-looking attitude. It looks like he only cares about his time, his own power, And the other difference is that the government and the state is corrupt. There is almost no accountability, and there is no keeping the promise. So half of the society doesn't trust him anymore. And I don't think Atatürk ever had that problem during his life or after.
Nice to have you two here for what is, to be sure, a solemn anniversary of a war that the battle of which we're going to be discussing started 100 years ago next week. And let's put a little history on the screen before we start here. The first Battle of Ypres, if you would, please, Sheldon, was October 19th to November 22nd, 1914, but we are going to remember the second Battle of Ypres, which started April 22nd, 1915, and went until May 25th, 1915. That was Canada's part in it. It was fought by the 1st Canadian Division, together with other British Empire forces, the French and Belgian armies. It was the first time poison gas was used in war. The Germans released 160 tons of chlorine gas on Allied troops. More than 2,000 Canadians died. 4,500 Canadians were wounded or captured. In the end, there were 70,000 Allied casualties and 35,000 German casualties. Ypres, as we need to remember, is in Belgium, in the southwestern part of the country, near the border with France. And Mélanie, let's start by asking why, in your view, it was so important to the overall war effort.
It had a logistical significance because, as you said, it was close to the coastal port, so it was important to bring troops, to bring war supply. But it also had a major emotional significance for the Allies because they had lost over 60,000 soldiers in the first Battle of Ypres, so they wanted to hold to Ypres with dear life. It was the last major Belgian city in Allied hands.
What would you add to that, Alan, about why it's so historically significant?
I think the impact of the battle on the people at home, that it was reported as a glorious victory. And these untried Canadian troops, nobody knew how Canadian troops would perform in battle. They were the first sort of levies, if you like, who were not professional soldiers going into battle. And there was a great concern that these undisciplined colonials would not hold. And in fact, when the reports started coming in to the newspapers in Canada in April after the battle, they were laudatory. The Canadians had held the line, saved the day, at great sacrifice. And this, I think, created a feeling of patriotism, a legend, if I can use that word in its correct context, of the Canadian soldiers who had shown exemplary bravery. And it turned at home as the casualty lists came in, because that was the next act. First you had the reports of the bravery. Then and only then, after a period of a couple of weeks, telegram after telegram after telegram descends on Canadian homes in the large cities. And suddenly the cost of this battle is apparent. And so what had been an adventure is now a war, and what was a war would become a crusade.
I want to ask you both about what might be the greatest poem ever written during wartime, which emerges from this battle in Belgium 100 years ago next week. In Flanders Field, John McCrae, Lieutenant Colonel. What do you like about the poem?
Well, it's interesting the way the poem has evolved. The first two stanzas of this poem are very conventional, sort of Victorian poetry. He talks about crosses, but he doesn't mention killing and bodies and so on. He talks about the dead, but in the language of sacrifice. It's very conventional. It's the third stanza that's arresting.
Before you get to that, we should just remind everybody, this is, in Flanders Field,
the poppies
blow.
Blow between the crosses, row on row that mark our graves, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly.
Good for you. How much can you do the whole
thing
by heart?
Below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. But it's the third stanza. Now this poem is written on the battlefield. It's published in December 1915, so it's a little later, but it very well expresses the view. The last stanza, take up our quarrel with the foe. To you with failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, We shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. Now, today we listen to that, we hear it every Remembrance Day, and we think of it in fairly abstract terms. At the time, it was a clarion call to answer the sacrifice of these men who had given so much. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep. Those are powerful words.
That's not
in the middle of the
pacifism
war.
there, is it?
Not at all.
Although it's kind of, would you say it's taken on that connotation over the years?
Well, I mean, the torch, obviously the war is over, so we interpret that torch in a different way today. And I think that's what gives the poem its continuing relevance. That torch can be the torch of lasting peace. It can be the torch of development, of brotherhood, or whatever. But it was not seen that way in 1915.
Here is an account from one survivor of the Lusitania disaster. She's on a rescue ship and she wants to know about the captain. A woman approached Captain Turner and began telling him about the loss of her child. Her voice was low, almost a monotone. She had placed the boy on a raft, she said. The raft then capsized and her son was gone. In the same dispassionate manner, she told Turner that her son's death had been unnecessary, that it was caused by the lack of organization and discipline among the crew. Is she right about that?
Possibly. One element of the story. First of all, wartime, many British sailors had already been, commandeered is not the right term, but they had been required to go into the Navy and had wanted to go into the Navy. So the quality of the available crews was not the highest, not the most experienced. They did have many experienced crewmen aboard, but the overall quality was not terribly high. But another factor came to play. And that is that many of the crew were killed instantly when the torpedo struck, because they were in the luggage hold very near the point of impact. Because, yet another sort of fluky thing, they were trying to get all the luggage together to bring it up onto deck, because the arrival was going to take in Liverpool was the next day, and they had to get everything, all the luggage prepared. And so many of them were killed, and they were the seamen, the experienced seamen, who would be most capable of launching the boats, lifeboats, safely. So that was all part of the story.
But let me follow up on the lifeboat angle, because anybody who saw the Titanic movie remembers they didn't have enough lifeboats, they didn't have life jackets, they couldn't deploy the lifeboats when it came time to doing so. Any of those issues at play with the Lusitania?
Interestingly, the Lusitania had more than enough lifeboats. That was the issue with the Titanic. They did not have enough lifeboats. And because of the Titanic disaster, every liner had to have enough lifeboats. In the case of the Lusitania, it had more than enough lifeboats.
And Titanic is just 2.5 years earlier.
2.5 years earlier. So it had plenty of lifeboats. But what happened, and again, talking about the phenomenology of this day and this attack, because of the nature of the hole in the hull and the inrush of water, the ship almost immediately took on a 25-degree list to starboard, if you can imagine that. And what that effectively meant was that half the lifeboats were unusable, or should have been. People tried to use them, and with catastrophic result. What I mean there is that if you think about the ship listing to starboard 25 degrees, the lifeboats on the port side want to lean in against the superstructure. So if you release them, they're coming in, no matter what you do. Right. Those on the starboard side, meanwhile, once lowered to the rails, are going to be hanging out from the hull as much as 8 feet.
Right.
Now, it's scary to begin with if you think about getting into a lifeboat 60 feet above the sea. If you think about trying to span a gap also between you and the lifeboat, it's downright terrifying.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety. They're all on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.